Hey guys, welcome to Zim Reads. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about poetry, a little bit about some of the books that are on my to-be-read list, as well as an idea that I'm floating around that I'd like to get started that can help us engage with each other, as well as get you free books. So let's jump in. For starters, I want to jump into poetry, and I want to read a little bit of poetry. One of my favorite poets, as I mentioned in my first video, is Billy Collins. Now, Billy Collins has a ton of collections of poetry out. He was the Poet Laureate of America for a while. I'm not exactly sure how long that role is kept, but he was that. He has a masterclass on poetry as well, and you can find a ton of his content online. But my favorite medium to engage Billy Collins in is my favorite medium to engage most poetry in, the written word. So I want to read you one of his poems called Introduction to Poetry and talk about it a little bit. And I would love your guys' thoughts on this. But one thing to know about Billy Collins and his poetry, he is a free-form poet. So he's not sticking, usually, 99 times out of 100, he is not writing a poem that has any conventional structure to it. It's not a sonnet, it's not a haiku, it's not a limerick. God help us with the limericks. It is free-form. And that is my favorite kind of poetry. In fact, it's really hard for me to engage with lots of other types of poetry. There are some poems that I do enjoy that are of a conventional structure. But my favorite type of poetry to read, my favorite type of poetry to hear read, my favorite type of poetry to write is freeform poetry. And I think probably in the early days of poetic expression, freeform wasn't really recognized as poetry. And to me, what's happened is a beautiful thing, because similar to what Death of a Salesman did by Arthur Miller to plays, I think freeform poetry, and I don't know really who would have been the first groundbreaking poet to kind of enter into this structure, but I think what it has done is it's shaken up our understanding of what poetry can be. What Death of a Salesman did for plays, for tragedies, really was it took it from this lofty concept of only the royals who have so much to lose can experience tragedy. And so, you know, tragedies were written from that royal perspective of watching someone from a high level descend to a place of destitution, of emptiness and loss, great loss. But the idea was tragedy couldn't exist for individuals that were normal commoners. And obviously, you and I, as fellow commoners, know that that's not true. We experience tragedy all the time. We know of people experiencing tragedy or walking through tragedy all the time that are not kings and queens. So what Death of a Salesman did is it brought tragedy into a whole new realm in terms of analyzing the fact that normal people can experience tragedy as well, and the tragedy play can be as beautiful and as impactful as if you're writing it about royals and royalty and a descent on a level like that. So, what did freeform poetry do for us? It brought poetry into the commoner's language, I think, and you didn't have to contain or subdue your poetry to the structure that was demanded by convention and demanded by you know, the great poetic minds that all had a say in this. It brought it into normal language. And so for you that want to like poetry, but every time you pick up a collection of poetic works, you just find yourself bored, or the mental gymnastics that you have to kind of introduce into that moment is just more than you want to handle, I really, really strongly recommend that you jump into some of the freeform poetry. And there's lots of it out there. I'm going to touch on Billy Collins and one of my other favorites, E. Cummings, who is no longer alive. Billy Collins is still alive, still writing, still releasing poetry, so that's exciting. But those are two I'm going to touch on. Another great poet, one of my favorites, Langston Hughes. Check him out, an African-American poet that has written such beautiful stuff in modern free form, but also has some poetry that's really beautiful that subdues to a structure as well. And there's lots of rhythm in his poetry. It's beautiful. I highly recommend Langston Hughes. And you know, there are others, obviously, but I want to touch on Billy Collins today. I'm going to read Introduction to Poetry to you because I think it's a great place for us to start and talk about some other aspects around art. So let's do it. Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Bam! That is poetry. Okay, that's Introduction to Poetry. Literally, that is the title of the poem. But what I love about what he's doing there, it's simple language, but he's using metaphor to display and showcase what a poem really is. It's not something that is meant to be tied to a chair and have a confession tortured out of it, or begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And not only poetry, but all art, really. Music, movie making, literature, painting, all of that. So often as critics, I was going to say critisers, so often as critics, we want a confession from the creator of the art or the art itself. Tell me what it really means, instead of pressing an ear up to its hive or dropping a mouse into a poem and watching it probe its way out. What is he talking about? He's talking about poetry is meant to be felt. It's meant to be breathed. It's meant to be heard and listened to. It's meant to be examined in a curious way, the way you would dropping a mouse into a box to watch it, find its way out of the maze. Hold it up to the light like a color slide. Examine the beautiful colors that it's displaying. Don't beat a confession out of it. So that is one thing I love about Billy Collins. One thing he does so well is he starts with these thoughts that are, flowing. There is flow and there is a syntax to it, though free form. But he ends with this moment that kind of suddenly exposes you. It suddenly reveals something to you. It's like a splash on a still lake. Suddenly you're looking at this beautiful thing that's moving you, and then you hear a splash come out of nowhere. It's art. It's something beautiful that he's able to do. And that's just one of his poems. I'm going to read more of his poems in later videos, but that was an introduction. Now I want to touch on E.E. Cummings. Now, the thing, if you've ever heard of E.E. Cummings, you probably know him as a very unusual poet, because a lot of what he writes is what would be termed the poetry of the eye. The poem is shaped weird, and he's got parenthetical phrases all throughout. He has weird grammar and weird punctuation, and it's sometimes very confusing to read. So I say E.E. Cummings is one of my favorite poets, but there's tons of his poetry that I have not yet been moved by or even really been able to engage. And so as you journey in poetry, I encourage you also to be okay with that, to not have to love every moment. It's not like reading a novel. Oftentimes when I'm looking at a collection of poems, I am flipping through until I find one that hooks me. And that's okay. You do not have to read it poem by poem, and if a poem is not moving you, don't keep reading it unless you feel like maybe it will. But I would say find one that's moving you from the beginning, and those are the poems that are ringing a bell in you. They're striking a chord that maybe other poems by the same poet will not, but I encourage you to stay at it. So this is one I actually recently found that I think there's a line in here that is just stunning. And so here's what I'm gonna uncover for us. He starts out, into the strenuous briefness life, hand organs in April, darkness friends, I charge laughing. Into the hair-thin tints of yellow dawn, into the women-colored twilight, I smilingly glide. I into the big vermilion departure swim, sayingly, do you think the I do world is probably made of roses and hello, of so longs and ashes. So there's lots, this is a great example of a poem that there's moments in it that are not as delicious as other moments in it to me. And the most delicious moment for me of the entire poem is how he opens. And I had even cut out the next 3 lines and just have the first and fourth line be like a mantra over a banner over me, which says, into the strenuous briefness, I charge laughing. I love that because life is a strenuous briefness. What a way to encapsulate this concept of life. Into the strenuous briefness, I charge laughing. I love that. He's running into it to fight, but he's laughing at the same time. I think that that's brilliant. And one other that I think is beautiful here. Who are you, little I, 5 or 6 years old, peering from some high window at the gold of November sunset and feeling that if day has to become night, this is a beautiful way. I love that. Peering from some high window at the gold of November sunset and feeling that if day has to become night, this is a beautiful way. That's what poetry is meant to do. It's meant to frame moments that you have felt, that you do feel, that you did not ever frame with language. And the poet, the artist, the songwriter, the novelist, what they're doing so poignantly and so powerfully is framing for us the moments that are so human. And it is human to stare out at the gold of a November sunset and feel that if day has to become night, this is a beautiful way for that to happen. So if you're having trouble with poetry, I highly recommend jumping into some of these freeform guys and giving yourself a little bit of leniency to just explore and find what you want. And if you've never written poetry and thought poetry has to be written in this conventional, standard way, I recommend considering sitting down and just writing human thoughts. Because that, my friends, is art. That is what art is meant to be. Observing what you see, observing the human experience, and honestly showcasing it. That's art. And don't beat a confession out of the art that you engage. Drop a mouse into it and watch it probe its way out. Okay, next section. I want to talk about some of what is on my to-be-read list. What I've done is, after discovering Vlogbrothers, a YouTube channel on here that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Many of you are familiar with John Green, his brother Hank Green. Well, I happened on them only recently, and I knew about the movie The Fault in Our Stars and knew it was based on a book, but I didn't pursue that any further. Loved the movie, wept bitterly in the movie, thought it was well acted, well written, beautifully casted, and just a great movie. I have not yet read the book. And in discovering John Green, I also discovered, Looking for Alaska, his first novel, has been adapted into an 8-part Hulu series. This is exciting. I really am enjoying watching this guy talk. Let me jump in to Looking for Alaska. So my wife and I watched all 8 episodes of Looking for Alaska. Also loved it. So what happened? I went on thriftbooks.com. I found every single John Green novel, which I think it's 5 of them, and I ordered them. They were like $3.50 each, all hardcover. So I'm excited about that. And my first one finally arrived, and serendipitously, it was John Green's first novel, Looking for Alaska, which I wanted to read first because I wanted to start chronologically. I wanted to experience John Green's career as I'm engaging John Green's fictitious worlds and stories. So the first one arrived, Looking for Alaska. It is a beautiful hardcover. It is the new special 10th anniversary edition of the book, and it's a very gorgeous book. I do love this book. And so I've started it. I'm about 90 pages in and looking forward to devouring this. And then my other John Green books should be arriving tomorrow. And just going down the line. So I think the one after this is An Abundance of Catherines, and then is Paper Towns, and then is the critically acclaimed The Fault in Our Stars, and then Turtles All the Way Down. So I'm looking forward to jumping into those books for sure. What am I also reading right now? I'm also reading Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone by James Baldwin. If you don't know who James Baldwin is, he was an African-American writer that was also very involved in the civil rights movement and close friends with both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and one of the most powerful, articulate voices on the Black experience in America, the systemic racism in America. And if you've never listened to him or heard him speak on anything, I encourage you to YouTube him. He is no longer living. He passed away in 1987, I believe, and of cancer of some kind, but was a beautiful, beautiful soul. And I've been diving into his writings lately with everything going on with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all of that. And James Baldwin's voice has been beautiful in shaping in me understanding, in exposing in me my ignorance, and in disturbing my conscience and drawing me into just the layers and layers and layers of understanding. And so I highly encourage jumping into James Baldwin. One of his novels is called Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. I'm only about a quarter of the way through, probably, maybe a little less. It is awesome. I'm loving it. His essays are awesome. I'm loving his essays as well. But highly encourage James Baldwin. And anything that he's written, you cannot go wrong. Another book I am reading to continue my Newbery Medal winning journey is Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech, who I've already read Walk Two Moons, and it will unravel you. It is junior fiction, so I guess on the scales it would be a step younger than young adult, but it is something that I would recommend to any adult to read. It's a stunningly beautiful story that is so full of grief, and you will weep. You will have a lump in your throat after reading the book anytime you talk about it. So I highly encourage you to read Walk Two Moons. I'm going through it a second time, and that's something I'm reading right now. So as far as other books, I know that I've got something else that I've been in lately, but I can't think of it. So I'll end there. Now on to the next part of this episode. I want to talk about an idea that I am formulating for the BookTube community. So there is this thing called Paperback Swap. Some of you may be aware of it. There's another version of it called bookmooch.com, I think. Both of these sites essentially enable people to trade books. And that's what they do. I thought it would be cool to take that concept, apply it to the BookTube community. So essentially what we would do is we would all consolidate a list of books that we are willing to put into the collective pool or the collective library or online book pool or whatever. Basically, books that you're willing to give away. And when you give away books, you get credits for having given books away. You also can get you get credit for just listing a book on the list and saying I'm willing to give away these 10 books. You get a certain point value for each book that you list. You get a certain point value for each book you actually give away and send. So those point values you can use to then purchase other books from the collective pool. That's how it works. So if you have a whole shelf of books that you're like, hey, I need to get rid of this, or I have doubles of this book, and so I can put this into the pool, other people can go on there and look and say, hey, I really want a copy of Looking for Alaska. Let me see if it's in the collective BookTube pool, whatever we end up calling it. They find a copy, they can order it, you pay the shipping to that person. Media mail's like $2 to $5 or something like that. But any book that you order off of there using your credits, you get a free book. So that's what I am putting together. I'm going to figure out an infrastructure for us to be able to do that. If you're interested, let me know. If you are interested, tell your friends, because the more people that put books on there, the more of a pool we have to pull from, and we can get free books and trade them for books that we have. So that excites me. It should excite you if you like books and like getting old books, and maybe we'll work something in where it's like, hey, if you send off a book, you got to write a note in the margins or something like that. And, that would be fun. So that about wraps it up, guys. We hit the poetry, we hit the to be read list, we hit the book pool idea, and appreciate everybody's support. If you like this channel, go ahead and subscribe, please. Hit the like button on the video and share it out to your friends. And also let me know in the comments what you think of the poetry that I shared. Do you have poems or poets that you really love that you think people should dive in and feast on? Let me know. Let's have the conversation. And I look forward to sharing more poetry with you in the future. Until then, read more and stay safe and be kind and love, and drop a mouse into a poem and watch it probe its way out, or find its way out, whatever Billy Collins says. Farewell.